It will restart, but it'll be an indication of a bigger issue within the APU. So moving on to engines, so engine performance restoration or overhaul. And same as the APU, it's a non-condition component that will require repair due to performance deterioration or fault, but engines can also become life limited due to longer MTBRs for newer engines. So if you see an MTBR written somewhere, what that is it's a mean time between removals. So if you're working at a company and they're talking about how long an engine will last on wing, that's essentially what they're talking about. It's a lot more art than science, really, in figuring out how long that will be, but it's going to be essential, as you'll see later on in the presentation, when it comes to calculating reserve rates. So the work scope planning guide gives instructions on the minimum level of work required for each module in order to give the engine maximum condition on wing life. And then the environmental impact on engines can be seen when an engine is in shop and disassembled. Usually findings relate to the hot section, so that's the HPT or high pressure turbine and your combustor, and the loss of the TBC, so your thermal barrier coating, which results in shorter time on wing. And in the pictures just there below, this is the combustor of I want to say a CFM56 5B, but I can't actually remember. And essentially, the engine should look like that. The combustor should look like that all inside. Actually, sorry, I'm jumping ahead here. So for those that aren't familiar with engines and how they work, the combustor is where the fuel and air mixes within the engine. It's ignited in this chamber here, and then it's pushed out of the guide vanes at the back and through to the turbine to rotate the actual internal parts of the engine. So usually if there's been very little impact of environmental operations and the engine hasn't been flown for a very long time, it'll look uniform all over. But these white sections here that we're looking at and the black sections in between them, that's basically deterioration of the hot parts. So the white part is the burning off of the barrier coating, and then the black section is actually the deterioration of the parent metal. And these are the reasons why engine performance restorations are so expensive, because these components are extremely complex to design and build and manufacture. So when we comes to replacement of them, the parts can go into the $500,000 territory very quickly. I just have this quick diagram of an engine, because as I said, not a lot of people are familiar with them. But essentially the engine is broken up into a couple of major modules, which is your fan major module. And basically the front end of the engine is your fan major module. So within that, you've got gearboxes, you've got a lot of accessories and components, but the ones we actually really care about for tonight are your fan blades, your fan case, the booster module, which contains the booster spool, the fan disc, and a couple of other parts. Then you're getting into your core. So that's your HPC here with all these sections. These are actually individual rotating discs and drums with blades attached to them. Your HPT will be here. The combustion chamber that we were just looking at is here, your HPT and your LPT. So basically your hot section is from the back of the fan the whole way through to the back of the HPT. Your LPT is from there to the end of the engine. And then your fan is the bit up front we were discussing already. So does anyone have any questions on what we've thrown up so far? I know there's a lot of information we've gone through, and some of it with the flavor for the reasons for the cost.
What was Joe's funny analogy about like suck bang?
It actually predates Joe, but basically how an engine works is suck, squeeze, bang, blow. So the air gets sucked in the front, squeezed down in the core, the bang is referring to the fuel and air mix exploding in the combustor and then blowing it out the back of the LPT. So suck, squeeze, bang, blow. If you guys are ever trying to remember how it works.
Transition.
Look, that's the end of the maintenance background that I had for you guys. It might be worth having a couple of minutes break just for people to clear their head now, Rob. And if any questions pop up in the interim, guys, I'll answer them when I come back.
Yeah, that's fine. How long do you want to do? 5 minutes, 10 minutes?
We'll do 5, 10 and see if there's any questions come in, and we can just address them then.
Okay.
So,
and just as an FYI, I posted quite a few supplemental readings to Moodle for you guys. They're pretty comprehensive guides on aircraft maintenance, reserve development, theory management, all that sort of stuff. So if you have time, you might download them and read them at your leisure. But you won't be quizzed or tested on it or anything like that.
And guys, really don't be afraid to ask questions, because I'm after seeing one of my favorite topics coming in already. So I'll talk for a while on that when I get back. Thank you. traditional engines. So it's 7:15, and essentially the answer will be back now. One or two people could just say they're here, and I'm not talking to myself. I'll kick off. Great. I see a few people typing there, so let's get going. The question that popped up actually during that break there was, will electric power replace traditional engines? Essentially, the answer is probably, but sorry, video's on there, Rob. Essentially, the answer will be probably will replace engines, but not for the foreseeable future. I was at a conference last week with an engine manufacturer, and they were running through their development programs for sustainable aviation. And I was flicking through my notes when I saw base, which the first one is sustainable aviation fuels. So it's biofuels, and traditionally sort of the ones you'd get from rapeseed and that kind of thing, but these would be manufactured in a way that wouldn't decimate farming, but would also produce much less CO2. So that's one area where they've been focusing quite a lot on in the past. I'm looking at the projections, and there's a turning point in roughly 2037 where they believe sustainable aviation fuels will become cheaper than Jet A1. Apart from that, they've actually conducted test flights with a lot of different engine manufacturers and aircraft types with the sustainable fuels. So that's an interesting one that will probably develop further in the next couple of years. The bigger areas where they're looking at is hydrogen, because it's pretty cheap to produce and it doesn't emit any CO2. So if aviation was to get to a carbon neutral point, it's going to be through the use of either electric or hydrogen. But that one's still a way off in the future. The other area that they're largely looking at is actually hybrid, so electrical and fuel based. I think electrical would be the ideal fuel, but it won't be available in commercial aviation technology for a long time as we know it. One interesting thing for you guys to look up in your free time is the eVTOL, so EVTOL. Avalon, which is actually partially owned by Oryx, placed an order for 500 eVTOL aircraft there last year. So they'll be coming out in the next couple of years. Basically, they're 100% electric aircraft for short trips around cities to replace essentially helicopters is how I see them being used. So exactly, Mairead. Yeah, I think the aircraft will probably make their debut in the next couple of years in Japan, in time for Expo 2025, I believe. But look, there's a long way to go on that, but it's pretty interesting seeing how the industry is developing. One thing that not a lot of people are aware of is actually the reduction of CO2 in aviation already. I think in the past 20 years, the CO2 emissions have been reduced 30 or 40% already. And with the newer engines that aircraft types that have come out in the last 4 or 5 years, CO2 emissions have actually reduced even further. So it seems everyone tries to blame aviation, but a lot of it is not actually aviation related. I think we account for less than 2% of the world's carbon emissions in total. And considering we've got more aircraft in the air now than we've ever had before, it's a pretty insignificant number in the grand scheme of things, especially as the newer technology aircraft become more commonplace and popular. And just there, what about solar power? That's just tying back in with the electrical. It's a long way off from being commercially viable. The power drain for flight would be too much for batteries as we have today. So essentially, you're starting to look into supercapacitors, and that's just a whole new technology that still needs to be developed. But anyway, sorry, enough of my rambling for tonight. Getting back into the presentation, so we're going to kick into the maintenance reserves and the background theory behind reserves. So what are maintenance reserves? Maintenance reserves are payments from the lessee to the owner of an aircraft designed to protect the maintenance life consumed on an aircraft and its related assets. So the purpose of maintenance reserves is to ensure the aircraft owner always has 100% life, neither metal value or cash. So just in the 3 graphs below, a brand new aircraft obviously has 100% metal, you've got no cash collected. When we're talking about a half-life aircraft, it's an aircraft that you've got half of the cash for, or you should have half of the cash for, and then half of the metal condition. And then a run-out aircraft is anything sort of 90% cash and less than 10% in metal life. And when we're saying metal life, we're talking about the intervals we were discussing for the engines, the APU, the landing gear, the airframe itself, and then the LLPs. So when we say 100% metal life, we mean everything is in a full life maintenance condition, and it's basically at its maximum time until its next overhaul or repair or restoration, whatever we're calling it today. So the purpose of maintenance reserves isn't actually to make profit. Maintenance reserves are protection for the owner. Now, there are ways you can tweak maintenance reserves to make profit, but essentially it's not the first place you look to unless you're being creative with an older asset at the end of its life. So maintenance reserves are collected for the items we've discussed previously, but the lessor owner can collect reserves for anything a lessee will agree to. So the majority of lease agreements will collect for the airframe, engines, landing gear, and APU. And some of the bigger aircraft, people try to collect for thrust reversers. Some lessees agree to it, some won't. It's going to be a commercial decision at the time of lease negotiation. Many of the reserved items have subsets within each item. Assuming a Boeing 737 again, a standard lease would collect for the below items. So an 8-year check, a 10-year check, 12-year engine performance, engine LLP, landing gear, and APU. So for the airframe heavy checks, the interval is monthly. So every month you'll collect basically the metal life lost through the monthly burn off the lessee. Engine performance, you'll collect for each flight hour within a month. Engine LLPs and landing gear, you'll collect for each cycle flown, so each flight flown by an airline, and then APU for each APU operating hour. I saw a couple of questions pop in there. So what has the owner been protected from? So what I think is being asked there is, what is the owner being protected from with reserves? Basically, there's a credit risk call on each aircraft lease, and maintenance reserves are a way of protecting an owner from a lessee's default. Look, I think most lessors in the world have had repossessions in the last year due to COVID-19. If there was no maintenance reserves and you have to repossess an aircraft, every bit of metal life consumed on that aircraft, if you're not holding reserves, it's gone, and there's no recourse usually to get that back. If an airline has gone into full bankruptcy, you can lodge a claim against the airlines, against what's left of the airline. But if the airline doesn't have any cash to pay, cents, if you're lucky, on the dollar for each dollar of metal life that's gone. And then there's another question: do lessors return unused portion of maintenance reserves? That's a difficult question to answer. Essentially, it depends on what's agreed in the lease agreement. So depending on how the lease was negotiated, they can return them, or if not, if it's not detailed in the lease, the lessor will hold on to them and they'll keep it in the reserve pool. It's a bit of a grey area, Natalia. So essentially, it just down to the commercial team of the airline versus the commercial team of the lessor, when they're negotiating these items. So why do we collect maintenance reserves? So while the value of a narrow-body aircraft could be in the region of 50 million, this is all just list prices that I've put in my head, by the way, but we assume it's 50 million. The value of the reserved assets could be over 18 to 20 million. These items we reserve can be restored to a full life position through certain maintenance activities. So when we're saying full life, we mean it's the maximum time until its next heavy item. So if we were to complete an 8-year check on the aircraft, we could restore that back to its full life position. So it's got 8 years until its next check for a cost of $850,000. Same with the 10-year, same with the 12-year with the costs below. Engine. So from OEM will last a lot longer on wing than an engine that's been through shop, even if it's a full overhaul. And then engine LLPs is a physical replacement of a part. So when that part is being replaced with a new one, it's got a full interval, or the new parts being put in, it should have a higher interval. We'll get into the calculation of that later. Landing gear and APU is the same as engines in the airframe. Essentially, you're restoring it back to the full interval. So, actually, I should probably leave the other slide on screen. There's probably a lot of questions as to the reason for the cost on these all these items here below. Getting into that a bit further, during airframe heavy checks, the interior of the aircraft can be removed. Many of the components of the aircraft are removed and will receive inspections and for replacement. Hundreds of man hours go into each check, along with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of new material and used material. So if we think back to the pictures I showed you in the earlier presentation, even taking out all the seats in an aircraft is hundreds of man hours. So there could be a crew of 4 or 5 guys taking out seats for days. All of this maintenance adds up with because the hours are billed individually to any material. And that's where the high costs we're seeing here of, $850,000 for the 8-year check, $400,000 for a 10-year, and over $1 million then for a 12-year. So it does get expensive quite quickly. And that's why the lessor reserves for them, because if you were to repossess an aircraft and you're reaching into your own pocket to fund these checks, it's quite significant, and it will impair your asset then for the rest of its life. So during engine performance restoration, the engine is broken down into its major modules. Depending on the work scope and what modules require work, the maintenance can take between 60 and 100 days of work. Actually, since COVID has kicked off, that's gone way up as well, because back in the day you could have had 5 or 6 guys working around an engine, whereas now, because of social distancing, you can only have 2 or 3 guys at most. So the turnaround times where an engine is not available to an operator or a owner has gone to nearly 6-7 months for one maintenance activity. And the material and man hours extended for core restoration would be in the region of 3 million, with a full engine overhaul of fan module, HPC, HPT, and LPT can be above 4 million. Now, this is assuming a narrow body engine again, just to reiterate that. The material costs in the engine are probably the most significant throughout the asset. Material costs in the engine is related to what we were describing earlier. It's the likes of the combustor. That's an extremely high temperature part. You're talking maybe 900 degrees Celsius of temperature in there. So everything in those components are like single crystal metals that can handle these heats, or they're specifically designed with airflow to actually shield the component from actually being in direct contact with any heat. So the replacement development costs of those parts is just insane. Moving on to engine LLPs. So above we mentioned the cost of material, but engine LLPs aren't even included in that 3 million we were discussing. Engine LLPs are reserved for separately due to the high cost of these parts and the strict part life which must be followed. A full set of LLPs for a narrow body aircraft costs above 4 million. Just sorry to give you a bit of an example. There's the LLPs in the fan at the front can have a life in the region of 30,000 cycles. The LLPs in the core can have a life in the region of 20,000, and the LPT is circa 25,000. So we're replacing these at different intervals, but we're trying to maximize the value from each run on wing. So a call has to be made between removing some parts early and trying to run other parts up to their life limits. And essentially, what is removed and below a certain threshold has no real resale value. So you can be throwing away hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of parts in every shop visit as well. So that's an extreme one to manage and maintain with any lease agreement negotiations we're doing. APUs this is one of the cheaper items along with landing gear. So you can usually negotiate a fixed price at the time of the shop visit, like 200,000 for a quick repair or 350,000 for a full shop visit. It's one that people generally tend to care less about. Same as the landing gear, the actual overhaul cost of the landing gear is quite low in comparison to the other items. So sometimes, in order to ensure you're fully protected on one of the more expensive items, people have been known to give slightly lower rates for your APU and landing gear. And just going back to the previous table up here. So if we look at that, the airframe checks are worth over $2 million. Each engine, the performance restoration is worth 3. Engine LLPs to say 4.5 million. So essentially, we're talking, as I said, the $18 to $20 million in total just for the maintenance life, and the majority. Any questions on that so far? Don't see anyone typing, so I'm going to keep plugging on. So how do we define the collection interval? The airframe manufacturer produces a document called the MPD. That's the maintenance planning document, and that dictates the required maintenance check interval for the aircraft. So in the example of a 737-800, Boeing tells us that we have to perform heavy checks at 8, 10, and 12-year intervals. Then the MPD also dictates the overhaul interval for landing gear, which is 10 years or 18,000 flight cycles for a nose landing gear, and then 10 years or 21,000 cycles for a main landing gear. So in the case where there's 2 restrictions, such as in landing gear, it's whichever interval is achieved first that's the limiting factor. And just actually on these, if anyone is working in aviation, do not take these numbers as gospel. These are all fictitious numbers, so don't be basing anything on these. Engine LLPs are limited to the Chapter 5 limit. What we mean by Chapter 5 is that's an ATA chapter, which is the defined structure for manuals for aircraft it basically it's set up by, it's used by FAA, it's used by EASA, it's used by everyone in aviation, these manual chapters, and it's an easy way to identify where components manuals will be. So chapter 72 is engines, power plant. Chapter 5 is the life limits. So if we're looking at landing gear or APUs or engines that have LLPs, chapter 5 within those manuals will always have the life limits published. So were published by the engine OEM, and the limits are approved by the certifying aviation authority, usually the FAA or EASA. So what we mean by that is when a new engine is developed, and if the OEM is targeting a 20,000 flight cycle limit, initially the parts aren't given that cycle 25 or 20,000 cycle limit. They're given a much lower one. So they initially might be approved for 1,000 or 2,000 cycles. They'll have to operate an engine for a couple of hundred cycles. They'll inspect the parts. They'll determine that there's no massive stress or fatigue on the design of the parts. They'll keep operating it, and they have to justify and prove to the aviation authority that's certifying their product that the part is safe to operate beyond each interval until it reaches its design goal. So the OEM publishes LLP pricing annually, and this is the basis for the maintenance reserve pricing. The OEM have complete control over LLP pricing. Essentially, they design and manufacture the parts. This is the way most OEMs, engine OEMs, make their money. You generally lose money or break even when they sell engines with aircraft at new. But where they'll make their money is the maintenance and then the spare part sales later on in its life. So this is a big place where you'll see big escalations every year and increase in pricing. But it's generally set by the OEM and no one has any control over it, so it's generally just accepted. So the last one that I wanted to discuss is the collection interval for engines. So this is, it's nowhere near straightforward as the other items. So when it comes to predicting the interval for engine performance restoration, there's several items we need to consider. So engines are on-condition components, and I mentioned this previously. This means that they only receive maintenance when required. So the engine OEMs usually provide a simple severity table, which the lessor will need to interpret along with other guidance data from the OEM to predict the likely interval for the engine. So this goes back to the MTBR discussion that I mentioned earlier. Essentially, the graph here is what the OEM is a simple graphic of what the OEM provides. And from this graph, we have to determine how long our engine will last on wing for each operator, and it will give us, I don't know, say 25,000 hours. But we have to generate that from the flight leg, which is along the bottom of the graph, and the D rate, which is shown here with the different severity curves. Now, what D rate means is if an engine is rated to 26,000 pounds of thrust, you don't necessarily need that for every flight. I mean, if you're using a car as an example, if you're taking off from a traffic light, your foot isn't on the floor, and your accelerator isn't on the floor at the start of every drive. You only use the power that's required. So many times an airline will actually have a D rate policy, which will be a minimum D rate of 5%, but then that increases based on the passenger load and the weight of the fuel and any cargo. So when you're going to an aircraft gate and you're told your bag is too heavy, the reason for that is that they need to calculate and know exactly how much weight is within the aircraft to be able to calculate their takeoffs. And if you go onto the likes of Aviation Herald, you'll see a lot of incidents come from incorrect data loading within the flight management computer, and that can come from the likes of, you know, a simple miscalculation of units. One could be imperial and one could be metric, or it can come from just human error. But they can select a too high of a D rate, and then they can actually have trouble taking off from a runway depending on where it is. But when you figure out where you are on this graph, you get your severity factor from the left-hand side of the graph here. And then from that, you can actually adjust the data the OEM gives you to your specific flight leg, and then figure out roughly how long the engine should last, depending on its operation. One other item that has to be considered for engines is actually your regional severity. So certain countries and certain regions have different air quality indexes. And this isn't picking any countries in particular. This is scientific fact that certain countries have higher sand particulate. If we look at this map here, the sort of yellowy orange countries have high sand particulate matter within the air. And what that means is the cooling tubes within the hot section of the engines can have sand passing through them. While it could be too small for us to be able to see with our eyes, it definitely impacts the interior of the engine and how it all works. The compression ratios within the newer engines especially can be like 30 to 40, 50 to 1 even. So as the air gets really compressed down, there's much bigger impact of the sand within the engines, and that has a further impact then on your interval. So you have to adjust it appropriately. So Middle East, North Africa has high sand particulate. India has high chemical matter within the air, and then that also has an effect on the internals of the engine. It can cause corrosion and oxidization within the hot sections. And then China and a little bit of the southern part of Russia there, that can be pollution and sand driven as well. So basically, within those regions, there's further adjustments that need to be made. And look, this is the OEM guidance in this graph. They're giving us a band of 60% adjustments to be made depending on your regional severity. So they're not very helpful, but we just know that it can impact. So every lessor will actually have their own method of calculating and adjusting for different regions. And something that's not even on this graph is, we consider Mexico City, I think it's 7,000 feet above sea level. That's quite a high altitude takeoff, and that means generally you have to use a much lower D rate, so more power to take off, because the air is quite thin in comparison. So hot and high takeoffs is another thing that we have to factor in. But yeah, just wanted to give a bit of a background on all that. And there's a question there, so I'll go back to the previous graph. So the question is, does the previous graph consider the cumulative effect of operating an aircraft or engine for thousands of hours? So essentially what this graph is this is a severity factor graph. When we're given our annual data from an OEM, it might say a first run engine will run for 25,000 hours. A second run engine will run for 20,000 hours. We have to adjust that by the severity factor related. So there's a severity factor related to our D rate, which just say we assume 10% is the middle line there, the third line up, and then our flight leg. So if we're saying we're operating at, what's that, 2 to 1, and on a 10% D rate, it's a 1:1 severity, so we're multiplying the hours by 1. As you can see, it sort of tapers off above 3%, but on the older technology 737s, like the NGs or the A320ceos, essentially no one was really operating them above 3 to 1. It was the odd operator, but that was sort of the magic number for cutoff. After that, it just also dissipated into 1. With the newer technology aircraft, the A320neos, the Maxes, and the 320, the extended range options, and there's the XLRs as well. They're operating 5, 6, 7, sometimes 8 to 1, so 8 hours for one cycle, and that's an impact that we don't understand yet on these narrow body engines. All I know is time will tell on that, but I'd imagine the hours they should accumulate will be significantly above operating an engine at 1:1, for example, or 2:1. But it's just about adjusting the data you have by the severity factor for swapping over from one operator to another, or for analyzing your annual update from the OEM. Hope that answers your question. So, yeah. So look, on engines, there's a lot of factors to take in. I know there's companies that have made fortunes forecasting this for other companies, and then there's other companies that have lost fortunes through miscalculation. So it's really one that generally goes through a specific power plant team or a maintenance forecasting team that have years of expertise in this. Every leasing company has some method of performing these calculations. Which one is right, I couldn't tell you, but I know that our one, we've spent hundreds of man hours analyzing data from all over the world, and there's a certain cutoff point where you just have to accept your data is pretty good. And generally, we try and target within a 10% forecasting for engine shop visits. There's a question there. So how do lessors develop this data, and what types of algorithms are used? Without getting too into the specifics, we've used programs like Python and MATLAB to analyze graphs and data points of our engine shop visits and to turn them into severity adjustment tables. Some of the, like if we were to we put our tables into Excel, and they were thousands of lines deep with data points for each type of severity adjustment you could possibly make. I could probably do a full night on just how to predict engine maintenance, but it's definitely an interesting topic. And if you do actually look into it, there's some IATA publications, and then there's actually a couple of masters and thesis documents that have been produced by students throughout the years that are quite interesting on the topic if you're into it. So then, shooting back to APUs and the collection interval. So look, this is kind of similar to engines. It's an on-condition component. It's determined by the MTBR, mean time between removals, and that's generally advised by the OEMs. And then it's similar to engines. APUs have Chapter 5s, LLPs, and the Chapter 5 limit is quite high in comparison to the MTBRs. So I think on some APU LLPs, the limits are above 60,000 cycles. But then in general, the APU might only operate for 5 to 10,000 hours. So it's very unlikely that the APUs will ever actually achieve their LLP limits. And in recent years, actually, some of the bigger APUs on the some wide bodies have actually had LLP limits removed entirely. So it's a bit of a moving finish line on that one. And then because APUs are a cheaper engine, we generally don't reserve individually for the APU LLPs. The cost of the LLPs is actually included into the performance rate. So while reserves are a payment from the lessee to the owner, it should be noted that they are not generally for profit. The owner and lessor will hold on to the reserves during the lease term, but following the completion of a maintenance or qualifying maintenance event, owner or lessor will have to repay the evidenced cost of the event or return the full amount of reserves held in the notional account to the lessee. So essentially, this is going back to the comment I think from Natalia earlier. It's entirely dependent on what's in each specific lease agreement. Certain lessors will care about the reserves different ways, and some of them will call them different names. But if a lessee has performed a qualifying maintenance event, generally the lessor is legally obliged to repay them. And the reason I'm putting the word qualifying in there is certain items are generally excluded. I think I actually have a bit of a section on it later on, but just as a quick summary, if an event is performed that's insurable, so if a bird flies through an engine and there's an engine restoration, the lessor might not be obligated under the legalities within the lease to give any money back to the lessee. And generally that would be insured, but then the insurance might not pay the full amount, and then look, there's generally a commercial discussion between the lessor and the lessee. And I can't talk for all lessors, but if there's been an out of pocket by the lessee, but the work has been performed, there usually can be a resolution between the two parties. Okay, so we're going to kick into the calculation of maintenance reserves next. If I am not being clear with anything, guys, don't be afraid to pipe up. I'm not sure if I am getting into everything right, but we'll go through this bit now anyway. So just this below table just gives a quick example of how to calculate each one, and this is at a basic level, and it's not actually getting into the intrinsic items within each specific aspect of it. But engine LLP replacement, so it's a fixed cost, which is your catalog cost, which is a document published by the OEM, divided by the fixed interval, which is the Chapter 5 limit I've been mentioning throughout tonight. So it's essentially a quick and easy calculation on engine LLPs. Airframe heavy maintenance visit, so it's a variable cost, as we were going through earlier, and even at that, that's just the costs I assumed for this. Essentially, the variability of those costs boils down to each specific airline, the MRO that's performing the maintenance if the airline's not, the contract that's negotiated, whether it's an airline-owned MRO or whatnot. So there's a lot of variables within that cost, but it's the maintenance cost divided by the fixed interval. Landing gear overhaul is the same as the HMV, so it's the overhaul cost divided by the overhaul interval. Engine performance restoration, so much like the airframe maintenance visit, this is a negotiated cost or an agreed cost, or an invoiced cost, I should have mentioned as well, divided by the variable interval that we've been discussing previously. So this is where your calculation of how long an engine will last is very important, because it actually determines the rate you're going to charge the airline per month. And then the APU performance restoration is the same calculation as the engine PR, but it's a much smaller dollar impact. So it's generally just the PR cost, the assumed PR cost divided by the MTBR. So I wanted to start running through some just rough examples of how to calculate maintenance reserves. So I've just pulled together essentially what a standard engine LLP list would look like. Many engines have a variety of different prices and life limits per part. The cost per cycle must be calculated on a part-by-part basis in order to come up with the engine cost per cycle. So the engine cost per cycle is exactly what it sounds like. It's the maintenance cost to operate an engine for one flight. So this doesn't actually include fuel. This is only on the LLPs. So looking back at the formula from the previous table, it's catalog costs divided by cyclic limit. So going through the first part there, the fan disc. There. So our fan disc new from the OEM would cost us $200,000. For our Chapter 5 limit is 28,000 cycles. We calculate out a dollar price of $7.14 per cycle. Look, maybe in your own time you can run through and calculate the costs per engine, but I just wanted to give a bit of a sample initially anyway. A question has come in there: do you reserve anything for unscheduled shop visits? Essentially, on a non-condition component, nearly everything can be an unscheduled shop visit. Generally, people will have induction dates and forecast dates, but it's a hard one to answer really, unless you're referring to the likes of like an incident-related maintenance event. Like if it's an incident-related maintenance event, such as a bird strike or a blade failure or something like that, it's generally not reserved for. But it'll depend on things like insurance, if the event is insurable, the level of work performed, and generally a discussion between the airline and the lessor or the owner. It's not a hard and fast rule, but there is certain excluded items within the lease agreements that actually dictate what is and isn't covered from the day one of the lease agreement. So it's it's a difficult one to answer, but we can discuss it later on towards the end of the presentation. Sorry, I'm not used to talking so much. So I've gone through here and just actually done the calculations that we were discussing in the previous one. Do have a go yourself and play around with the limits and the values just to make sure you understand it. But the engine LLPs is a relatively straightforward calculation. So our fan disc is $7.14 a cycle, booster spool is $10, and so on and so forth. Basically, the total per engine per one flight works out as $141.70. Once we have calculated the cost per cycle for the engine LLPs, the only other item to consider for a lease agreement is the escalation. So this is to allow for the annual increase in cost of the parts by the manufacturer. So depending on the manufacturer and the, I suppose the age of the engine. So for an engine that's been well developed, the escalation can be fairly stable. For newer engines, it can be higher because there's more research and development costs being invested into the engine. But if we look at, just say, the examples we're using here, we say it's going to range from 4 to 7% for engine LLPs. If the 2020, I should probably update that now to 2021, but if the 2020 rate is $141.70, escalating it by 4%, our 2021 rate would be $148.79. And that's a compounding interest, escalation, that we apply to the engines year on year for the duration of a lease agreement. Basically, we get our escalation figures generally on LLPs from the OEM. Most lease agreements for engine LLPs won't actually have a percentage. They would actually have language that would say in line with the OEM's CLP, which stands for catalog list price. So that means that if we guessed a 4% escalation and 1 year it was a 5 or 6% escalation, we would actually be losing money. Whereas if we just tether it to the manufacturer's CLP, it's directly related to whatever the published pricing is per year. Sorry, there's a couple of questions after coming in, guys, so bear with me while I get to them. Okay, so one question. If it's a used aircraft and a second lease, how to determine the maintenance reserves in such a case? Actually, I do have an example of a used aircraft later on in the presentation, so we'll definitely circle back to that. Another question, just to clarify, did you say that a new technology engine would have a higher escalation? That's what I've seen in recent years. The research and development cost has been escalating higher due to the redevelopment of parts and the redesign of parts. So we've seen the higher escalation on the newer engines at the minute, whereas the older technology engines have been more stable in their escalation. But they're more established. There's much less R&D going into those engines, and this is where the manufacturer is actually just making their profit from the development of the engine itself from new. So there's another comment there. Shall we calculate the LLPs from new part of a used part? I'm not sure the exact question there, but I suppose if my understanding is correct, it's for a used part being installed in the engine, we calculate the value from new. If that is the question, what I would do is, sorry, I've been told to go back. Oh, sorry. I'll actually be going through a used example on a used aircraft being placed with a new lessee. So perhaps that would answer your question there, and we can actually go through that in detail later on. If that works for you. And then, yeah. And look, if there's any further questions, feel free to reach out after, or even send an email following the course. There's another question: who pays for the unused LLP cycles? That's a bit of a grey area as well, depending on the lease agreement. Generally, there's no rule. In a lease agreement, sometimes a lease will call out the value for any wasted LLPs or wastage will be to the account of the lessee or the owner. If it doesn't call it out, there can be a discussion over who retains possession of the parts. If there's any value left in it, it can be worth the lessor's while or the owner's while taking back the part. If the lessee has another business use for it, they might want to retain the part, and we can discount it off the value of the replacement part. So that's not necessarily called out in each lease agreement. It may be, but if it's not, it's generally a discussion point between the lessor and the lessee. My personal preference is to always discount the unused cycles from an LLP part when we're replacing it. And then there's a final question there: what is the manufacturer's CLP? The manufacturer's CLP is the catalog list price. What that is every year the manufacturer will actually issue a list of components and parts for its engine and the price associated for the coming year. So actually, at the start of November, most OEMs will issue that catalog. It's basically a list of thousands of parts and the price you're going to pay for it for the next year. So from that book, we can actually pull out the pricing for each of our LLPs based on the part number, or if our part number isn't listed, the replacement part number for that part, and then the associated cost with it. So there's quite a lot within that book, and that's where when we're saying CLP, the catalog list price, that's actually what we're referring to is their catalog of the pricing. Thanks for the good questions, guys. So it's 8 o'clock. Rob, should we take a quick 5-10 minutes just to give people's brains a quick rest, rather than powering into the airframes, or should we keep going? I'm easy either way. Either way.
Completely your guys' preference. Do you guys want to take another 5 minutes, or do you want to power on? Going once.
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
5
Yeah, it's a heavy topic, guys. That's why I'm trying to break it down as much as possible. So, any questions? Cheers, guys. So hopefully people are back now. If one or two could just shout out, and then we'll kick on. Yeah, a couple of people, right. So we went through the engine LLPs. That's one of the more simple ones. I'm going to have to start speeding up, I think, looking at the time I've left, by the way, and the material to be covered. But basically, for your airframe, it's relatively straightforward as well. You have your estimated costs. So it's the heavy, what's the heavy section, inspection costs from that formula, but it's your heavy check cost divided by the interval. So if we assume an 8-year is going to cost $650,000, divided by the 96 months, you're going to come out with $6,770.83. Same for the 10-year, you're going to work out as $3,166 a month. And then for the 12-year, it's working out as $5,347. The big thing to note on airframe costs is a lessor should have a database of how much range of costs previously for a similar check. Sorry, there's a question there. Which prices are for which region? So when we're discussing the regions earlier, that was generally for engines, and there's no real impact on airframe for heavy checks or engine LLPs for that. And another question, what is the criteria for a lessor to place such prices? Essentially, it's industry learning. So you're going to have a database of all the maintenance reserve claims you've seen, or you have basically a database of OEM costs, which are based on worldwide costs, their costs, and then you'll have your own costs as well. So it's building all that into a model to be able to best guess the maintenance costs. And in China and Russia, the maintenance would be cheaper, but it depends on what OEMs or MROs you've approved. So essentially, the MROs have to be usually EASA or FAA compliant, along with your local authority for the aviation authority. But in saying that, essentially a maintenance reserve is to protect the owner. So I don't care if the lessee is in China or Russia. I want to know how much it's going to cost me to do in the event that I have to pull the aircraft back early and I have to perform the maintenance. So I'm going to base the costs in my lease agreements on what I've seen in Europe or America for completing an 8-year tech, a 10-year, 12-year. So pushing on to the landing gear, and guys, keep the questions coming in and I'll just read them whenever I get to them as well. So assuming the landing gear will be calendar limited, so it's based on months rather than on the cyclic count, we'll divide the costs by the calendar, that's in this, sorry, typo there, calendar interval to establish the rate. So if we assume the cost for the landing gear overhaul is $350,000, 120 months, it's going to work out as $2,916 a month. If the lessee is known to have a high cyclic operation and is likely to hit the hard time limit, so the hard time limit is your the 20,000 cycles, or it's 18,000 cycles for the nose and 21,000 cycles for the main landing gear. You have to sort of tailor the lease for that. A lessee's specific operation should be known at the time of lease negotiation, and the rates will be tailored to their specific operation. So if you're placing an aircraft with a lessee, a quick check on flight radar will tell you what their operations generally like, the flight legs, etc. If we assume the lessee will operate 8 short flights a day and will consume 244 cycles a month, we'll have to do a cyclical calculation. So if we assume the cost for the nose landing gear is $105,000 with a cyclic limit of 18,000, that calculates out that your rate per cycle is $5.83. So you multiply that by the monthly cycles consumed. So it would work out as 1,423 for the nose landing gear, and the same calculation, but 2,846 for the differing price and the differing cyclic limit for the main landing gear. So totaling out 4,270. Now you can average that out and just bill them for the assumed cycles consumed on the landing gear, or it can be an actual calculation at the beginning of the next month for the cycles consumed in the previous month. So a blended rate across the main landing gear and nose landing gear will be 4,270 per month to allow for a shorter overhaul interval. There's a couple of questions came in there. So can the lessee challenge maintenance reserve quoted by the lessor? Would they do that? They can generally. At the negotiation of a lease agreement, there will be negotiation and discussion between both sides to set the maintenance reserves. If they feel we're being too harsh, they will generally let us know pretty quickly, and we'll have to make an adjustment based on their experience versus our experience, and where we'll usually end up is somewhere in the middle of our costs and their costs. So we're both taking a bit of a hit in that regard. Another question, why should the lessee pay reserves on most expensive rates? Lessor can take airline money based on a higher rate and perform maintenance in China, for example. Difference can be twice. Yeah, that's very true. But when I'm setting rates, I'm not necessarily going for the most expensive rates. I'm literally averaging it out around the world usually. I know some maintenance will be cheaper in China, but for example, some aviation authorities might not accept a Chinese MRO. So it's not necessarily about going for the cheapest rate either. And from experience, generally, some of the MROs with the cheaper rates also have bigger problems when it comes to certification and work being performed. So it's a balancing act when we're setting reserves and when we're planning maintenance on an aircraft to find an MRO that is reasonably priced, but also competent in the maintenance they perform. And I'm not saying any approved MRO is incompetent. It's finding somewhere that works for you, with you, and helps you perform the maintenance, because these checks are extremely complex with a lot of variables that have to go your way in order to get the maintenance done correctly. Another question there, how does the lessor keep track of the number of flights their lessee has? So at the time of lease negotiation, they would say, for example, they have a flight a day, but then they have two a day. In short, I'm wondering if lessee could lie to a lessor about the number of flights they have a day. Generally, when we'll do our own due diligence during lease negotiation and make ourselves comfortable with the operation of a specific airline. If it's a new airline, they generally don't have that. So what we do to protect ourselves in that regard is we'll actually have adjustment tables. So if you operate at 1 to 1, 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1, the whole way up, and we'll have a adjustment factor for the rates that we're charging. I think I've actually got an example of that later on, and I can show you on the engines. With regards to landing gear, look, it's a much smaller cost, but at the end of the day, if nothing goes wrong within the lease agreement, then if we haven't collected enough money to pay for the full overhaul, the lessee is going to make up the difference. And if we repossess it, we haven't collected enough. It's our fault for not agreeing the right rates at the time of lease placement. So I'm just going to brush over this APU calculation. So if we assume the APU is an MTBR, so mean time between removals of 8,000 hours, APU hours, the cost of the APU overhaul is 350,000. Our rate is 43 an hour. So while the calculation for engine rate is straightforward, The art, and I'm going back to art rather than science, of calculating the MTBR is more troublesome. So I've already mentioned a bit on this, but I'll just run over it again. The OEM will only ever issue a minimal amount of data on the MTBR. So many lessors have built up large databases containing all the data points that we can obtain. Factors that need to be considered for MTBR calculation are the engine run, so whether it's a first run out from the manufacturer or a second run that's already had a previous maintenance event, the engine D rate, the hour to cycle ratio, the operational environment, the engine model. Some manufacturers have enhanced models that improve MTBR. So it's like a first generation, second generation, third generation iPhone. The third one has the battery that lasts longest. And then another one that I'm thinking here that I haven't actually included is the LLP life remaining if it's a second run engine. And there might not be enough LLPs to allow the engine reach its natural next engine performance restoration as well. So in this working example, the OEM has advised a interval of 20,000 hours at a 10% D rate for an engine operating at 1.5 to 1 in a benign environment, so a neutral environment. If we say the cost of the overhaul is going to be $3 million, sorry, the MTBR should not have APU hours in there, but it's the MTBR is 20,000 hours. Dividing 3 million by 20,000, our rate works out to be $150 per flight hour per engine. In a lease agreement, the lessee will often request a table of rates, as they will operate at more than 1 hour to cycle ratio throughout the term of the lease. So depending on the term of the lease and the age of the aircraft, a first run and mature run rate might be needed. The table below incorporates both multiple hour to cycle ratios along with a 5 and 10% D rate for first run and mature run engines. So in that table there, this goes back to address one of the previous questions. So first run 1-to-1 at 5% D rate, we'll just say it's going to be $195 per hour, whereas at a 10% it's going to be $175 per hour. And then if we have that same engine on a mature run, we're assuming that the LLPs won't be the restrictive item. It's going to reach its natural EPR, which then means at 5% D rate we're at $235 an hour, and then at 10% we're at $225 per hour. So if we look at the 10% there, there's a $40 per hour difference, which doesn't seem like a lot, but if we're talking $40 per hour over 20,000 hours, it's quite significant. And that's just something that airlines and lessors all understand. It's the wear on the metal becomes more evident as the engine matures and becomes more has done more performance restorations. The cost associated grows not exponentially, but it grows significantly enough. And the other point I want to make here on this slide is the 5%, 10% difference there. Essentially, the lower the D rate is, and I mentioned this previously, I think, the lower the D rate, the higher the wear on the engines. So the shorter the MTBR becomes. So when we're assuming our MTBR, we have to assume at a baseline of, I think, 10% D rate and 1.5 to 1. So our baseline assumption is here in this lower table, but we are adjusting it left and right for differing hours and differing D rate and differing runs. So there's a bit to take in there, guys, but I hope I've explained it well. So looking at a working example of calculating maintenance reserves for a used aircraft. If we were to calculate the MR rates for a used aircraft, we will have some information about the general condition of the aircraft and the related funds that are held. We will then be in a position to calculate our pre-funding and MR rates. So what pre-funding is when I deliver a used aircraft to Rob, the life consumed won't be full life. So I'll have to give him a cash contribution to pay for the life consumed as of the delivery date. While in an ideal world, your cash held will be directly proportional to the life remaining, it often isn't the case. So I think in this example here, the aircraft was redelivered from its first lease with fresh from its 8-year check. So that's a full life item, but with zero cash held. There's 20% life remaining on its 10-year and 33% remaining on its 12-year check. The engine performance restoration has 31% life remaining. The engine LLP is at 44%. So essentially, in this situation, we've done an 8-year check. There's still some life remaining, albeit low on the 10-year and the landing gear and APU. We don't actually have enough cash collected to be able to perform those maintenance events. So rather than performing them prior to delivery, we're going to give the cash contribution to say, when it falls due, we're going to have our contribution completely paid off for the life consumed. And generally, lessees are agreeable to that. So the 8-year fund, the aircraft was redelivered fresh from its 8-year. That means we can use the cost rate without any pre-fund. So we're just going to calculate the rates for the next lease as the cost of the event. So we're assuming 850,000 divided by 96 months. So we're coming out with our 8854. For the 10-year fund, the aircraft has never had a 10-year check and has consumed 8 years of its current event. We assume the total event cost would be 400,000. We should hold 320,000, but due to low rates in the first lease, we actually only hold 300,000. So with 24 months remaining until the 10-year, we'll attempt to reduce the pre-fund by collecting a higher rate by dividing the remaining costs by the remaining time to the event. So if we're going to be 100,000 short, we'll divide that by the 24 months until the check, which will give us a rate of 4,166 per month. So that means at the time of the 10-year check, we'll have cash that's required, and also the funds should be above what's required for the 10-year. The 12-year fund, as above, will ensure that the amount held is not below the required amount at the 12-year check. So 48 months remaining and the $620,000 cash held. The balance is 380,000 divided by 48 months. So we're going to charge the airline $7,916 a month. And this will ensure that we don't have to pre-fund any additional amount and the cash we hold is sufficient. So sorry, this example is assuming the first lease did have maintenance reserves rather than end of lease compensation, which I'll touch on after we get through this example. Engine performance restoration. So I've just broken the calculation down here a bit more simply. So we know the engines have about 17% performance life remaining. What we will need is the expected mean time for this engine. If we assume the next lessee will operate at 2-to-1, and the MTBR for an engine at this ratio is 28,000 hours first run, we know that we'd expect the engine to operate at further 8,680 hours. And this is assuming the same hour cycle ratio for the next lessee. We currently hold 2.2 million, and the first run shop visit cost is expected to be 3 million. So as above, in order to make sure we're fully funded for the next shop visit, we're going to divide the 810,000 by the hours remaining, 8680. So we're coming out at an hourly rate of 93.31 per hour. Mature shop visit costs are higher due to the offset module maintenance. So if you recall the previous LLP table, where we had one limit in the core, a different limit in the turbine. So the core is the HPC and the HPT, a different limit in the turbine and a different limit in the fan. We will not be overhauling all of those modules at the same time, and we'll be planning out the maintenance. So the lessee will be planning out the maintenance based on the condition of each module, essentially. So we'll also be required to calculate a mature run rate based on that. The mature run is usually shorter than the first run with a more expensive shop visit. If we assume the mature run will be 25% shorter, we now have an interval of 21,000 hours, and the mature shop visit cost on average 20% higher. So we've updated our costs to be in the region of 3.6 million. So 3.6 million divided by 21,000 works out as $171.43 per hour. These costs and MTBRs are being exaggerated, guys, just so you can see the difference. Don't forget to shout out with any questions if I'm covering something too fast as well. I don't mind going back. But there was a question earlier on the calculation of used LLPs. So I'm hoping this addressed your question. We currently hold 2.52 million in the engine LLP fund, and we need to figure out the value of the stack. And when we're referring to a stack, we're talking about the full engine part list. And with regards to life remaining, we must work out the value of each LLP on a part-by-part basis, but this time reflecting the life consumed by each part. So combining the total held value and the remaining value, we are fully funded as the total is 4.5 million. This means we can charge CLP. But if you go through the example on the bottom here, we're saying our fan disk is 296,053. Our chapter 5 limit is 28,000. So our remaining life is 12,320 cycles. So if we calculate our cost per cycle based on the chapter 5 limit and the new part price, it works out to be $10.57 per cycle. Multiplying that by our cycle remaining, we'll come up with 130,263. Sorry. So we do this across the board, and then we come out with a remaining value on our LLP stack of 1.98 million, which then we add into the funds we currently hold, which then gives us our 4.5 million. I can't remember who asked the question earlier, but I'm hoping that it addresses it. So continuing on down this path for the working example, the landing gear has 20% life remaining, or 24 months, until its next overhaul. We currently hold 340,000, and that results that we need to collect 60,000 in the next 2 years. If we look at the remaining term, it's $60,000 divided by 24. So we're saying we need to collect $2,500 per month. But this will actually underfund us going forward, as the rate was high in the first lease. So in this situation, the rate will have to reflect the next run following the overhaul, which would mean that it's the $400,000 cost divided by 120 months, which would give us the 3,334 per month. Now, in this situation, if the lessee was switched on, they'd actually be asking for a full refund of reserves at the timing of the maintenance event. But that'll all depend on what costs they've seen and what they feel the monthly value is on the landing gear. Generally, a lessor won't volunteer the cash back if the lessee isn't requesting it. So it's definitely on the lessee to ensure that that gets captured in any negotiations. And then moving on to the APU, if we currently hold 280,000, and the APU is 20% life remaining until the next shop visit with an overhaul cost of 350,000, the APU should achieve 1,600 hours, which we'll calculate with $70,000, 1,600 hours divided by 1,600 hours will give us $43.75 per hour, per APU hour, in order to ensure we're fully funded. Sorry, I'm choking here on nothing. So, is there any questions on the used example that we just ran through? It is a basic example, and if anyone is working in it, they can guarantee you that it's not that simple. But that's just to show. The question there, what rates do you typically use for the cash contribution for the second lease? Are they based on the first or second lessee's rates? For cash contributions, if the engines have been on a first run or I'll start with the engines. If the engines are still on a first run, I'll offer a first run rate as a cash contribution because we're still going to be working on the first shop visit. For a airframe check or APU or landing gear, where there's not really a massive delta between a first run or a second run, I'll generally try and use the second lessee's rates, assuming or hoping that they're actually lower than the first lessee. But generally, we try not to offer cash that's above what we held coming out of the first lease. If the first lease was a return compensation, which means the risk team at the lessor has made the determination that there's not much of a chance that the lessee will go bankrupt within the term, we may elect that we won't actually collect monthly reserves. We will get a payment based on the condition on the last day of the lease term. And if that's the case, it's generally a straightforward refund based on that. If the rates were high in the first lease, I'll agree a lower rate in the second lease, and I'll try and sweep a bit of cash from that if I can. But as I said earlier, the reserves are generally not for profit, so if we won't be designing lease rates to get away with that. It's just if the opportunity arises, it can be a nice way to sweep a bit of cash for other projects. So rate escalation. I know I've discussed this quickly for the engine LLPs, but every rate within a lease agreement for maintenance will escalate. So when calculating rates, we'll use an assumed costs at a point in time. These costs are made up of labor and material. So it's usually a 70-30 split, I think, for airframe. That's just a number that was given to me by a former tutor within my experience, but I don't actually know if there's any science in those numbers without going through each check individually. This was just a rule he had. So as we know, the cost of labor and part manufacturing aren't stagnant, resulting in an annual increase referred to as escalation. The two main ways to set lease escalation are through indices or a fixed value. So indices track the known increase of costs through publicly available inflation data. This option has been declining in the past few years due to complicated formulas and an unknown final position. But I've given just an example of the employment cost index. So this will be one of the indices referred to. And as you can see, since 2009, it's gone from, I'll say, $107 up to $130 per hour. So there's a significant growth within the labor costs alone in general. When we're reflecting that within a lease agreement, I think the lowest escalation I've ever seen was 2% in a lease agreement. But essentially, the escalation is whatever's agreed with the lessee at the time of negotiation. I think the golden number most lessors try not to go below is 3% escalation. But then at 3.5 would be on the better side. And then, look, I've never seen a 4 without a lessee that wasn't nearly an immediate bankruptcy risk. So it's based on risk and then whatever the lessee is willing to agree to within the negotiation. I've given an example here of a fixed rate escalation where the MR rates are increased by a fixed value, usually negotiated in the LOI or the lease agreement. The value range is usually between 2.5 and 4%. So I think I probably should have written it down, but I think this was a 3% escalation. And to say if we assume a dollar rate of $120 in 2009, escalating that up to 2020, we're going from $120 to $166. So like an increase of $46 per hour a cycle or for whatever you're billing them on can be quite significant then if you're for your billings and your collections. There's a question there. In determining the escalation rates, do you consult with the OEM? Generally, no. So for engine LLPs, we would consult with the OEM. But Generally, for the non-fixed values such as engine performance restoration, airframe heavy check, or APU overhaul, landing gear overhaul, we all have our own contracts anyway with the MROs, because in the event of a repossession, we need to be able to perform maintenance on the components. So we would see roughly year on year what the MROs are charging. Generally, it's around that 3% number of an escalation year on year to allow for cost of living increases and then material increases. But generally, it's each lessor will make their own determination based on what they feel the market is, where the market is at, and what they've seen in the past. So just touching back then onto engine LLPs. They're manufactured by the OEM, and as such, they have full control. They fully control the escalation. The rate at which they escalate varies depending on where the product is in its life cycle. But on average, we would expect to see it somewhere in the region of 5 to 7% escalation for engine LLPs. So, touching on maintenance reserve claims. Maintenance reserve claims are when a lessee requests reimbursement of the held reserves following a QME, a qualifying maintenance event, such as an airframe heavy check, engine restoration, engine LLP replacements, landing gear overhaul, or APU restoration. The aircraft lease will detail the specific criteria that the lessee has to meet in order for the event to qualify for the release of reserves. But typically, there'll be a set definition for the event. So I've just thrown in some generic definitions. We'll just look at the one here for the 8C, which is a 12-year check, because it's your 8C check. So the 12-year check means the heavy airframe structural and zonal inspection of the aircraft and resulting repairs, which is referring to the non-routine tasks that I spoke about earlier, including a C check. All MPD tasks that are having an interval of 12 years and performed concurrently therewith such additional flight hour or cycle controlled MPD structural and zonal inspections, and including all lower level checks then falling due. What that means in English is there's two types of inspections within the MPD. There's structural inspections, which is the structure holding your aircraft together, and your zonal inspections, which is the different regions within the aircraft. Basically, any inspection that has a 12-year interval or lower has to be completed in order for the 12-year check to be complied with. So when we're going through a maintenance reserve claim to ensure that this has been done, we're literally filtering out a list of hundreds and hundreds of tasks and ensuring that everything that should have been done has been done by the lessee. Now, if there's a few bits that have fallen out on the wayside, generally there can be a discussion held with the lessee, as long as those tasks are completed shortly thereafter or have been completed shortly before. That's down to each lessor, because if we were to go down through the court of law, the lease says one thing, and if the lessee hasn't complied with that, there's no obligation on the lessor to reimburse the lessee anything. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but an engine performance restoration, I've put a sample definition in here. So it means at a minimum the accomplishment of performance level work scope, which is your performance restoration level work scope, on the HPC, high pressure compressor, the combustor, the high pressure turbine, and pursuant to the then current engine manufacturer's work scope planning guide. So the work scope planning guide is the document that tells us what modules need to be restored or overhauled in order to restore the engine to its maximum condition on wing life. And then additional items that need to be repaired during those maintenance checks need to be complied with as well in order to the engine to meet those definitions usually. So how the claims work. So the lessor will receive a full data pack from the lessee of the technical records for the event. Once these have been reviewed by the lessor, we'll confirm whether it is qualifying or not. The lessee generally then provides the details of all costs incurred, which will be reviewed against the lease to verify that the costs can be recouped. Most lease agreements will have an exclusions list. So if there's an excluded item, we won't pay for it because we're generally not reserving for it. So while there's no set list, usually airworthiness directives, handling charges, shipping, ferry flights, insurance, or any part that has a warranty or any foreign object damage won't be covered during a maintenance reserve claim. So some of these, like airworthiness directives, there can be airworthiness directive cost sharing formulas within a lease agreement, but an airline has to comply with any AD that's issued in order to be able to operate the aircraft. Handling charges, shipping or ferrying, that's to do with the lessee's negotiation of their maintenance contract. So we have no control over it and no view of it, and it's no value to us, so we won't pay for it. If an event is insurable, we won't pay for it, and I've listed out insurance items separately to foreign object damage, but generally foreign object damage is insurable. When we're discussing foreign object damage, what we're actually getting at is the likes of a bird strike going through an engine, a bus going into the side of an aircraft at an airport, that kind of thing, because it's highly unusual, but it will be insurable. But it's definitely worth calling out as a separate excluded event. And then warranted parts. So if the manufacturer has a warranty to replace a part or to heavily discount the price of a part, we won't pay for the warranted part of that claim. So the final step, once the lessor is satisfied that the event is being completed in accordance with the lease agreement and all excluded items have been deducted from the claim, the lessor will reimburse that at whatever agreed amount is to the lessee for the qualifying maintenance event, fully in terms with the lease agreement, and as said, keeping in mind the exclusions above. So any questions on that so far? I know I'm brushing over this, but like each lessor does have their own method and approvals for handling maintenance reserve claims, so it's quite an ad hoc topic to get into. I just wanted to touch a little bit on end of lease compensation. So essentially the calculations are performed the exact same way as they would for the delivery of a used aircraft, but we're assuming the condition as of the last day of the lease agreement. So an alternative to maintenance reserves for a lessee is the end of lease compensation. Although this is usually reserved for stronger credits, as I mentioned, if there's a default through the lease term, any maintenance life lost and cash not held is at the pure cost of the lessor. The risk should the lessee become bankrupt is that the lessor will be exposed following the repossession of the aircraft. Similar to an MR claim, the compensation will be based off QME definitions. So we'll be calculating back to the last qualifying maintenance event definition as of the last day of the lease term. And at the end of lease, the lessee will provide the technical records from the entire lease term, and the lessor will review and establish when the last QME was for each normally reserved item, in line with the lease agreement. I did a quick example up here. So in this example, we'll assume that the lease was established in 2010 with a 3% annual escalation and assumed 5% escalation on the engine LLPs. So I've calculated the rates out there for the 10-year lease term. I'm just going to skip over this because we'll actually utilize them on the next slide. So in this example, we'll assume that the lease was established in 2010 with a 3% escalation. As in the previous maintenance reserve example, we'll assume that the 8-year was performed as the redelivery check. Although thinking about it now, I probably should have done the 10-year based on a 10-year term. So the 8-year was zeroed, so it'll be $0 in return compensation. There's 24 months since the last 10 years, so 4,166. We're coming back with $100,000. And so on and so forth. It's a straight calculation based off the technical team's assessment of the last qualifying maintenance event for each engine. And it's the time since each event that we're focusing on here. The one very large benefit of end of lease compensation over maintenance reserves is that while if I'm collecting maintenance reserves throughout a 10-year lease term, there can be $40 an hour, for example, between the maintenance reserve rates in the first year of the lease term and the last year of the lease term. And so basically, we are not collecting the escalation, an escalation true up at the end of each year for the previous life consumed. So there will actually be a bit of an underfund situation at the end of the lease or in the event of a repossession. Whereas with a end of lease compensation calculation, the escalation takes place on the rate prior to the calculation of the reserves. And that means that we're essentially getting paid the full amount in $2020 or $2021, whatever year you want to put on it. So we're not losing that 3 or 4% every year or 5% on the engine LLPs through escalation because we're not collecting annually. And this is where it comes down to the credit risk. It's, would you rather, if the airline wasn't a stable airline or a tier 1 airline, you're taking the risk that you will protect yourself from the escalation loss, but you'll actually open yourself up to the repossession loss. So it's a balancing act, and it's usually one that a risk team and a commercial team will discuss and determine very early on before they even start drafting an LOI. So look, going through the engine LLPs, assuming the parts were replaced at the same time, one calculation can be used for both engines. Engine LLPs must always be calculated on a part-by-part basis. So basically, we're focusing on the cost per cycle again, but also the life consumed rather than the life remaining as we did earlier. So basically, we're just multiplying the life consumed on each part multiplied by the cost per cycle, which would give us $2.5 million in this example. So going through all the calculations we've done previously and adding them all up together, we'll roughly get $12.3 million in end of lease compensation back from the lessees. I shouldn't have sped up as much as I did, guys, but I'm after covering the material for tonight. I know there was quite a lot covered between the actual background of maintenance for aircraft and then the maintenance reserve calculations. We've a bit of time left, so is there anything you want me to run back over or any specific questions that you want to ask me? I'll give people a couple of minutes in case they... There's a couple of questions. Think is the most challenging aspect of maintenance reserve management? Definitely the most difficult part is forecasting either the costs for the heavy checks or CFM, GE, Rolls-Royce, Pratt & Whitney, the engine manufacturers won't share any of their MTBR data with you really, and they'll give you general assumptions to base your calculations on, but they'll generally protect their actual figures, so it won't. So they have the competitive edge for pricing other MROs and OEMs, because each OEM has its MRO network as well.
Sheen, I might just kind of add on to that question.
Go.
What percentage, I guess, if you can, generally speaking, what weighting would you give to the guidelines from OEMs versus the proprietary information that you guys collect and use to inform your decisions, that lessors use to inform their decisions? Because I know you alluded to before about, the various models and algorithms that you guys use. So there's quite a bit of input. So how much would you say lessors weight their own proprietary data versus OEM guidance? And that's particularly challenging, say, for new entrants to the market, right? Who don't have, so the likes of Oryx, they've been around for 30 plus years. So they have 30 years worth of data. If you look at a new lessor who doesn't have that, it might be relying too heavily on OEMs. Where do you kind of put the emphasis?
It really is a balancing act, but you're saying that Oryx is 30 years plus data. We do and we don't. We have 30 years plus of engine shop visit data, yeah. But most of those engines that we had in the early days aren't ever even used anymore. So we've had to throw all that data out because it's not applicable. So we've essentially, I suppose the better background, the better way to answer this question, Rob, is every lessor will have their own adjustments data based on what they've seen. The OEM data is actually generally pretty good data, but it's thousands of data points from all the different shop visits that take place in the previous years. But it's normalized into a little band of a couple of hundred hours, a couple of thousand hours. The trick for lessors is to actually figure out where the fluff is within the OEM numbers, and getting that maybe 20-30% band down to a 5 to 10% band that the lessor is comfortable at operating in. Because, as I mentioned earlier, our target is to forecast an engine shop visit within 10%. And if we can hit that metric of 10%, we're generally pretty happy.
Makes sense. Thanks. Didn't want to complicate things more, but just thought I'd embellish.
There's another question there. So, what sources do you use for your engine shop visit cost data? OEM, internal data, publications, or a bit of everything? Literally a bit of everything. Like if I see, well, I suppose, right, we'll start from the basics. The OEM data is your general MTBR data for the worldwide fleet in a benign environment and the general costs that they've seen within that time period. The internal data that we adjust the OEM data with, so as I mentioned earlier, that's our data from the years of shop visits. That we've got over 500 engines at the minute, so we've got pretty good data points to build into that. The publications is a bit more spurious in my opinion. If I can't see or understand the background data feeding into a publication or a graph or any sort of adjustment data for costs on heavy checks or overhauls or anything like that, I generally will disregard it, because as far as I'm concerned, it could be someone sitting in a bedroom somewhere just making up numbers to make, I don't know. If you don't understand it, don't use it, is always my opinion. And then the final question, is there a trend not to charge the maintenance reserves on a monthly basis? There definitely was a bit of a trend up until March 2020, when the world changed, for less people, I'm speaking for Oryx anyway, for us to charge less monthly reserves and moving more people onto end of lease compensation. I know for us, always our core credit airlines have been maintenance reserves rather than end of lease compensation, because at the end of the day, it's not my call or my CTO's call or anyone. It's a risk call that has to be made in the interest of the company based on your risk profile. I know there was an interview with I can't remember the name of the leasing company. It might have been Macquarie, recently, where they publicly announced that they're taking a different view on airline credit and risk, and going forward, they're going to be much less likely to extend return end of lease compensation rather than monthly maintenance reserves, because lessors lost a lot of money in the last year with bankruptcies, restructurings, and yeah, people seem to assume lessors have infinite funds and a lot of money, but at the end of the day, it's a business, and if we're losing money in the business, as an industry, we all have to reassess how we're managing our contracts. So there's definitely a change in the trend about not changing reserves. I think we're going to see a lot more lessees on end of lease compensation, or on monthly maintenance reserves rather than end of lease compensation. One other item which I didn't really touch on today, but it's probably worth mentioning, is RFPH programs. So, as you saw from the presentation today, engines in general are the most expensive item to reserve for within an aircraft. An RFPH program for an engine is a rate per flight hour. So it's basically maintenance reserves, but they're not paying the lessor, they're going to pay an MRO or the OEM. If a lessee is paying that, and there's a tripartite agreement of some sort which says, in the event of a default, the lessor can have the reserves paid or has access to them to perform maintenance. People generally don't charge maintenance reserves, but there still could be end of lease compensation. But that's not really a topic to get into with this sort of intro level course. There's definitely alternatives out there, but the trend is definitely going back to more security for the lessor or the financier. Yeah, guys, there's no more questions in, I don't think. Really appreciate the interactivity today. It's been quite a good group, and I've quite enjoyed this evening. If there's any further questions or items you want further information on, if you ping the question on to Rob, he'll give me a shout and I can get answers back to you. Thank you.
Oisin, thank you very, very much. It is greatly appreciated. I think it was quite informative. Like Oisin said, if you guys have any questions, feel free to ping them on to me. I'll hang back on for another minute or two, because I know some people had queries about the quiz we just had. I know we have one coming up as well. Feel free to stay on or drop off, Oisin, up to you.
Off, Rob, but thanks for that. Appreciate it.
Yes, thanks a million, Oisin. Appreciate it. How did you guys find Oisin's lecture? How did you guys find his lecture? Did you find it helpful, informative? No, no, you won't, Murray, to answer your question, you won't need to know that much detail. I just thought it would be helpful for you guys to at least have a full, clear picture about it. I suppose that's a cliche, Murray. So just before we drop off, Murray had asked before the session started about the quiz results. So the way it normally works is you'll receive your you'll receive your final grade at the end of the semester. If you're particularly interested in how you performed on the individual quiz, you can just drop me an email, and I'll let you know what you scored. I've already looked through the grades. Everyone did really, really well, so no need to be concerned about what your grade is. Thanks, Davide. Yeah, part of it was, at least what we're trying to achieve with the session is making it sort of very lessor focused or oriented, where you're understanding, you might be in aviation, but you're trying to understand these concepts from the perspective of a lessor, which what I'm hope we're trying to achieve. Jenny said it's good, but need to add some math to the modeling for calculation of our. Yes, obviously it's true. Those would be by no means, complex, or even, thorough, detailed modeling. More or less just to sort of give you guys a general sense of, the high level calculations and how lessors go about to, seeing what their numbers are or what they can come up with. But yeah, Jenny, you're spot on in terms of, it would by no means be a complete calculation or a complete model. Okay, well, it looks like we ended a bit early today, so you've got an extra 25 minutes free. If anything comes up, please do let me know. If I can answer it myself, I will. If not, I'll pass it on to Oisin. And then also, just as a reminder, I posted quite a few supplemental readings. They're quite, a lot of them, some of them are quite long and detailed, but I think they would be good for you to go through. And they'll also make good reference materials as, once you move on from the course and, starting other jobs, they're good to, so they're handy to have to print out and help by yourself and also, when needed. Okay, other than that, I think everyone enjoy the rest of your evening. Have a good night. Any questions, send them my way.